So much common space, common resources, public goods. Does capitalism work well when we have so much that is shared? One argument is that if you have a shared resource, the best way is to make one person in charge because they will have a vested interest in keeping it going. But we can't have one person in charge of the planet. And does that theory work out anyway? Is the solution to what's called the tragedy of the commons really just to privatise the commons? That's all today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, I think we all know the argument about the tragedy of the commons. That if you had a piece of common land and you allowed everyone to put their animals on it with no controls, then the land would be overgrazed, the animals would die, and everyone would lose their livelihoods. That's the argument. I think this analogy can be applied to so many aspects of economics and often ends up with the conclusion that the government should run everything, which, of course, given the governments we've had lately, is a very scary concept. There's another example in this scenario, though, Steve, that someone owns that land and rents it out, then he or she has the incentive to ensure that it isn't overgrazed. So the argument is, to avoid the tragedy of the commons, you just hand it over to private ownership. That might be the answer. It depends on the circumstances. It's a confusing picture, isn't it?
No, only if you... It's only difficult because you don't look back and say, well, how were the commons managed? And the answer was the commons were managed. They were managed by the community back in pre-capitalist days. And that's why the commons worked, because anybody who overgrazed was admonished and ultimately expelled from the community. So there was a collective management of that collective resource. And
again, that's a bit like, going back before the days of money, isn't it? When we were all living in
before
tribes,
the days of money. Hang on a sec. Which podcast is this?
I'm sure we've done one on that, haven't we? But we were tribes people, and we didn't have money.
Before the days
we had resources.
Before the days of industrial civilization. Yeah,
exactly. And then in those days, we did what had to be done, and we would obviously look after the earth because it wasn't our livelihood; it was our existence that depended on it. So, but then we were the days of communes almost. Well,
it's actually. I've got to actually read David Graeber's final book, the Dawn of Everything, because I've got a lot of sympathy to some of David's arguments, but other parts, from what I've heard, I haven't actually had a chance to read the book yet. I think it looks like he and Rengro, David Rengro, I think it is, downplay the pre-sedentary civilizations and their degree of complexity, and having been influenced by the book, the fictional series, The Clan of the Cave Bear, by Jean Earle, which is actually, Jean Earle actually financed a lot of the anthropologists who did the research into early Cro-Magnon societies. And the book basically puts that research into a fictionalized format. And a lot of that has this whole idea of a cycle of life, a realization that you had to maintain the area where you were. So this idea of managing resources which are known not to be owned by anybody. In fact, those resources, if anything, own us. That's the mentality we began from. So what has happened with neoclassicals and this whole idea of the so-called tragedy of the commons, they've ignored the fact that the commons was managed by the community in past civilizations, talked about it as if it's a free-for-all, and therefore the free-for-all means commons get destroyed, and therefore you've got to hand the free-for-all over to somebody who has a monopoly, and that person will take care of it because it's their source of income. It's all a distortion of the actual past history of commons.
Well, what you're describing is what Eleanor Ostrom, an American economist who won a Nobel Prize in economics, so that's possibly a bad start. But she argued, just what you've been saying, the commons could be managed by the collective owners, not by top-down regulation, but by the owners agreeing on choices, effective monitoring, having methods of conflict resolution. So a bit of a come-by-our approach, which sounds great. But if you take the commons and apply it at its highest level and call the planet the commons, it's not working, is it? Because
that is the serious issue, that we do have, like for example, the atmosphere. It wasn't an issue when we weren't burning fossil fuels. It wouldn't be an issue if we weren't burning fossil fuels in many ways. We weren't using the amount of energy we use. But since we are, and then when you dump this stuff into the atmosphere, then yes, the effect is felt somewhere else. At the same time, I wonder if you really had a genuine, tribal attitude to how we manage resources, and you then had the development of something like the internal combustion engine versus, for example, electric. Would there have been a decision we can't have this polluting monstrosity made back in that hypothetical tribal, commons-oriented civilization, and we would have had a totally different direction of technological.
Do you think so, or would they actually go and know that this is polluting, but that doesn't really matter because it's polluting elsewhere? Because the geography is a big part of this, isn't it? It's how big the commons is. So if you can do something in the commons to get more out of your patch of land, and it's not really what you do is detrimental to areas outside your patch of land, you're not going to care.
It varies. I mean, again, you've got to look at the civilization in which that occurred. You look at the Assyrians; they were happy to pollute the land of other peoples and kill them as well. You look at the American Indian civilizations; they had a lot of respect for and the Aboriginal and Australian Aboriginals. We've got a history of respecting the rights of other communities because that's, again, expected to be reciprocated back. So the more warlike humans are, the less they care about what they do damage outside their own environment. And there are variations in how warlike societies are. This is, again, part of the point that I know David goes into in that book. There's numerous ways in which you can organise human civilization, not just the ones that became dominant in the West. So, I think it is feasible to consider that we would have the intellectual and emotional maturity to recognise that if we damage somebody else's area, then they're going to come back and damage us, the sort of tit-for-tat attitude, and you don't want to have that happen. You respect not just your own territory, but the territory of others. But that's clearly not what we're doing.
No, and I'd argue everyone becomes warlike if push comes to shove, if the pressure's on for their own livelihood, and they're being put upon by others, then irrespective of the culture, everyone will become warlike. It's just that those cultures perhaps hadn't been exposed to the need for it.
Yeah, and we're seeing that. We're likely to start seeing that in spades now. So that competition is going to get much more severe.
Yeah, there's an encouraging thought. Look, if you want to hear this discussion in full, then you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or you can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. You'll be able to hear the full half hour of this podcast and all the other ones as well. We're back again next week with another one. I'm Phil Dobbie with Steve Keen. Thanks for listening. Catch you soon.